He abandoned me when I was fighting to live, but now that I'm finally built back up, the man who ran from my sickness is running toward a real killer, and I might be the only one who can save him. The sterile white of the hospital room was the first thing that always came back to me when I thought of that year. It was a cold, hard white, the kind that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the air, much like Mark had sucked the life right out of our shared dream. I was 26, fighting something serious, a bizarre, aggressive autoimmune thing the doctors were still struggling to name, let alone treat. I needed constant care, a cheerleader, a rock. I needed my husband. Mark wasn't a bad man, not inherently. He was charming, he could fix anything mechanical, and he had a laugh that used to shake the windows. But when the fight got ugly, when my hair started falling out in clumps and the fatigue became an immovable mountain, Mark folded. He didn't just falter, he vanished. It wasn't a dramatic blowout. It was a slow, insidious retreat. First he started staying out late, working extra shifts that never seemed to yield extra income. Then came the vague excuses about needing space, needing to clear his head from the constant gloom. One Tuesday, while I was hooked up to an IV drip, my mother called me to say she hadn't been able to reach him for 3 days. When she finally tracked him down, at his brother's apartment 3 states away, he was packed. He sent a text message later that evening. It was 5 lines long. The gist was, "I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I'm not strong enough for this version of you. I need out." That text hit harder than any diagnosis. Being sick was terrifying, but being abandoned by the person who promised forever, right when I was at my most vulnerable, felt like a spiritual amputation. I spent the next year rebuilding myself. It was a grueling, lonely process. I lost the house, the one we'd picked out curtains for, and moved into a cramped, slightly damp apartment above a bakery. I worked remotely, slowly climbing back up the corporate ladder I'd been forced to drop from. I learned to rely only on myself, forging a resilience that felt both hard-won and deeply bitter. I never remarried. I learned to cook for one, to watch movies alone, to celebrate small victories with just the sound of my own applause. Years bled into one another. 5 years, then 7. The illness stabilized. I found a new equilibrium, a life built on solid, self-made ground. Mark became a ghost story I occasionally told myself late at night, a cautionary tale about fragility. I successfully erased him from my daily existence. Then came the call. It wasn't Mark. It was his sister, Sarah. She sounded hesitant, her voice thick with an awkward tension I hadn't heard before. "Listen, Clara," she started. "I know this is probably too much to ask, and I totally understand if you hang up right now, but Mark's in trouble." My hand tightened around the phone. Trouble? I pictured him maybe totaling his truck or running into some minor legal issue. "What kind of trouble, Sarah?" I asked, my voice surprisingly level, betraying none of the sudden, sharp adrenaline spike. He's homeless, Clara. He lost his job about 6 months ago. Things spiraled fast. He's been sleeping in his car, but the car broke down for good last week. He's rough shape. He won't ask you, but I told him I was going to call. He just needs a place to crash for a week, maybe 2, until he can get back on his feet. You're the only person I could think of who might still have a soft spot." "A soft spot?" I laughed, a dry, hacking sound that made Sarah wince even over the phone. "Sarah, that man left me fighting for my life in an empty house. He's not getting a soft spot, he's getting a history lesson." I was about to hang up, the finality of my refusal already forming on my tongue, when Sarah whispered, almost desperately, "Clara, please. He's changed. And he's asking for you specifically. He said he deserves whatever you give him, but he needs to see you. He needs closure. And he needs a roof." I looked around my quiet, perfectly organized living room, the sunlight streaming onto the heirloom quilt my grandmother made. I had built this piece brick by painful brick. To let him back into this space felt like inviting a demolition crew, but the sheer audacity of it, him, the deserter, crawling back to my doorstep years later, head bowed and broken, it snagged my curiosity. I needed to see him. I needed to look into the eyes of the man who decided I wasn't worth fighting for and watch him beg. "Fine, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping to an icy monotone. "Tell him to come by tomorrow evening, but you tell him one thing very clearly. He gets 48 hours, not a week, and he steps foot in my house only if I let him in, nothing more." I hung up before Sarah could reply, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I spent the rest of the day scrubbing every surface, not because I wanted to welcome him, but because I wanted my sanctuary to shine as a testament to his failure. The next evening, the doorbell rang precisely at 6 p.m. I walked to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it. Standing there, looking older, thinner, and utterly defeated, was Mark. His eyes, red-rimmed and searching, locked onto mine, and he opened his mouth to speak. But before he could utter a single word of apology or request, a sudden sharp sound erupted from the apartment next door, a loud, frantic banging, followed by a man's guttural yell. Mark flinched violently, his face draining of color, and he stumbled backward, staring past me into the hallway as if whatever was happening next door was something he knew intimately. The sound from next door wasn't just noise. It was a raw, desperate plea mixed with sheer panic. It was the sound of a fight escalating too fast, a sound that immediately dragged me out of my icy standoff with Mark and threw me into high alert. I instinctively took a half step back, my hand gripping the doorframe. Mark, however, didn't just flinch. He recoiled as if he'd been struck by lightning. His eyes, wide and glazed over, weren't just looking past me into the hallway. They were focused on something specific, something that seemed to ignite a buried memory in his traumatized posture. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, turning my head to peer down the dimly lit corridor of the apartment building. The sound repeated, a heavy thud, followed by a woman's sharp, choked cry. Mark didn't answer. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, his body pressed tight against the door jamb beside me. His expensive, slightly too big jacket suddenly looked like a shroud on his skeletal frame. "We need to go," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp, entirely different from the broken man I expected to see begging for shelter. "Go where, Mark? Someone is being hurt in there." I pulled my gaze away from him, ready to knock on the neighboring door, ready to yell for the superintendent. This was my building, my community, and I wouldn't ignore distress. "No, Clara, don't!" Mark grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into my bicep. The sudden physical contact after years of complete separation shocked me into stillness. "Don't get involved. Just close the door." His urgency was primal, laced with a terror that felt disproportionate to a simple neighborly dispute. It wasn't the fear of an innocent bystander, it was the fear of exposure. "Mark, what are you talking about? You just arrived. You look like you haven't slept in days, and now you're telling me to ignore a potential assault?" I tried to pull my arm free, but he held fast, his grip agonizing. "It's not what you think," he pleaded, his eyes darting frantically towards the source of the noise, then back to me, pleading with a fervor that suggested his homelessness was the least of his problems. "Just close the door, please. For your own sake. I can't be here right now." "You can't be here? You're the one who showed up on my doorstep a minute ago asking for sanctuary." The hypocrisy was staggering. Here he was, demanding the very safety he had denied me, now trying to drag me away from helping someone else. The situation next door dissolved into a low, terrifying silence, which somehow felt heavier than the shouting. Then a new sound emerged, the distinct, slow squeak of a door being opened, followed by the heavy, uneven tread of footsteps approaching my door. Mark's face went utterly white. He didn't just look scared, he looked like a trapped animal. He shoved me hard toward the inside of my apartment, pushing past me with a desperate agility I didn't know he possessed. He slammed my door shut, fumbling immediately for the deadbolt, engaging it with a loud, metallic thunk. "Mark, what are you doing?" I felt a surge of anger. My carefully constructed boundary had been violated instantly. My safe space was compromised by his sudden, panicked behavior. He ignored me, whirling around, his eyes searching the room, not for an exit, but as if looking for a place to hide. "They can't see me here, Clara. You don't understand." "Understand what? That you're having some kind of episode? That you dragged me into something right as you walked in the door?" I backed away until my hips hit the edge of the kitchen counter, putting space between us. "Unlock my door right now." Just as I spoke, the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. A heavy silence settled, broken only by Mark's ragged breathing. Then came a slow, deliberate knock. Not the timid knock of a worried neighbor, but a firm, authoritative rap. Knock, knock, knock. Mark froze, his entire body rigid. He sank slowly to the floor, pulling himself against the wall behind the coat rack, trying to make himself invisible in the small entryway. A voice called out from the hallway, calm but carrying an undeniable weight of menace. It was a deep baritone, completely unfamiliar to me. "Open up, we know someone's in there. We just need to ask a few questions about the disturbance." My heart hammered against my ribs. Who were they? And why was Mark terrified of them? He was supposed to be the broken one, the one needing refuge. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for my cell phone on the hall table. Mark scrambled up, moving faster than humanly possible, and lunged toward me, knocking the phone out of my hand. It skittered under the sofa. "No police! You can't involve anyone else!" He gripped my shoulders again, his breath hot against my ear. "Listen to me, Clara. The reason I left you, the real reason, wasn't because you were sick. I was running from something big, and now it looks like it found me here. If they find me in your apartment, they will come for you too. You have to tell them I'm not here." Before I could process the gravity of his confession, that his desertion was premeditated flight, not cowardice, the knocking resumed, more insistent this time, accompanied by a low, persistent scraping sound against the wood of the door, as if someone was testing the lock. Then the baritone voice came again, closer this time, imbued with chilling patience. "We'll just wait then. No rush. We have all night. And we know you're in there, Mark. We saw your car abandoned a block away. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just open the door." Mark looked at me, and for the first time since he left me years ago, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. A fear far deeper than anything illness could inflict. He was trapped. And now, by opening the door for him, I was trapped right along with him. He pointed frantically toward the back hallway leading to my small bedroom. "The fire escape! Now!" The adrenaline that had been simmering beneath my disbelief suddenly boiled over into full-blown survival mode. The calm, measured menace in the man's voice outside solidified Mark's terror into a terrifying reality. This wasn't just a desperate husband seeking refuge. This was a fugitive running from something genuinely dangerous. My mind, honed by years of fighting for my health and independence, clicked into defensive planning. "The fire escape?" I echoed, my voice a tight whisper, adrenaline sharpening my focus. "That thing hasn't been inspected since the Nixon administration, Mark. It's rusted through." "It's our only shot," he hissed, shoving me toward the narrow hallway leading to the back of the apartment. He was all sharp angles and desperate energy, a stark contrast to the soft, weak man who had shown up moments earlier. "Hurry!" We scrambled down the short hallway. The scraping noise at the front door had stopped, replaced by a heavy, rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the floorboards. They were done asking nicely. I yanked open the thin metal door leading to the exterior stairs, the rusty hinges protesting with a screech that sounded deafening in the sudden quiet of my terror. Mark paused at the threshold, looking back toward the front of the apartment where the main door was clearly about to give way. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. "When we get down there," he instructed, his eyes darting between me and the hallway, "you run. Don't look back. Don't stop for me. Go to the police. Tell them anything. Just get away from this building." "I'm not leaving you," I snapped, suddenly realizing the depth of my residual stupid loyalty, or perhaps just the sheer protective instinct of a survivor being pulled into another's disaster. "You have to!" he roared, the sound echoing slightly in the stairwell. "This isn't about us, Clara. This is about what I did before you got sick. They don't care about you, but if they think you're protecting me, they'll use you." Before I could argue further, a splintering crack echoed from the living room, the sound of wood giving way under massive force. The front door had been breached. Mark didn't wait. He shoved me hard down the steep metal steps. I hit the first landing, stumbling, catching myself on the cold, pitted railing. I could hear Mark following right behind me, his heavy boots clanking against the metal treads. "Go, go," he urged, his voice hoarse. We reached the bottom landing, the ground level. The air here was damp, smelling of mildew and overflowing dumpsters. We burst out into the narrow, unlit alleyway behind the building, the shadows deep and absolute. "Which way?" I whispered, blinking rapidly, trying to adjust my eyes. "Left!" Mark pulled me roughly, dragging me around a stack of recycling bins. We sprinted toward the main street, putting distance between us and the looming threat of my apartment building. I could hear nothing from inside, no shouting, no sirens, just the pounding of my own heart and the uneven rhythm of Mark's frantic escape beside me. We reached the corner of the alley, which opened onto a busy, neon-lit avenue. Freedom felt tangible, just across the street. "Wait." Mark suddenly pulled us both to a dead stop, pressing us back into the shadow of the brick wall. "Don't cross yet." "Why not?" I was breathing hard, my lungs burning from the exertion, aggravated by the memory of my past illness. "They're not here." "They don't need to be here," Mark whispered, his voice laced with dread. He pointed a trembling finger across the avenue toward a brightly lit 24-hour convenience store on the far corner. Standing perfectly still, leaning against the glass storefront of the convenience store, was a tall figure in a dark coat. He wasn't looking toward us or toward my building. He was simply standing there, illuminated by the fluorescent glow, his posture radiating effortless control. "Who is that?" I asked, squinting, trying to reconcile this silent, watchful man with the chaotic noise from moments before. Mark didn't turn his head to look at the man. Instead, he stared fixedly at the figure's hands, which were currently occupied. The man was slowly, meticulously unwrapping a piece of hard candy, the small, crinkling sound of the wrapper, audible even from this distance, cutting through the city noise with unnerving clarity. "That's not who I'm worried about," Mark breathed, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. "That's just the lookout. The real problem—" He trailed off, his gaze locked onto something happening just out of my sightline, further down the street. Just then, a black, unmarked sedan, the kind you never see unless you're looking for trouble, glided silently to a stop exactly halfway down the block, blocking the exit from the alley we had just used. The rear passenger window silently slid down, revealing not a police officer, but a man with a perfectly groomed beard and a polished silver ring on his pinky finger. He didn't look angry or frantic. He looked like a CEO concluding a business deal. The man in the car leaned slightly out of the window, lifting a small black object, not a gun, but something sleek and metallic that caught the streetlights, and tapped it twice deliberately as if signaling a waiter. Mark let out a sound that was half choke, half whimper. He understood the signal. "They found the fire escape," he mumbled, scrambling backward, pulling me deeper into the alleyway. "They used it already. They were waiting for us to come out this way." The man by the convenience store finished unwrapping his candy, popped it into his mouth, and then, without turning his head toward us, he took one smooth, deliberate step away from the glass and vanished instantly into the deep shadow cast by a massive billboard towering over the sidewalk. The alley we were currently hiding in was a complete dead end if the street was blocked. Then, a new sound emerged from the darkness directly behind us, the metallic groan of the unsecured dumpster lid beginning to rise. Mark spun around, trapped between the approaching threat from the street and the rising lid of the dumpster right behind him. He looked wildly between the two unseen pursuers, his face a mask of absolute final defeat. He didn't look at me. He looked over my shoulder directly at whatever was emerging from the dumpster and whispered, his voice breaking entirely, "Oh God, not him. I thought he was locked up." The realization that Mark wasn't just running from low-level debt collectors or bad business partners, but from someone he genuinely feared was serving hard time, hit me with the force of a physical blow. "Not who? Mark, who are you talking about?" My voice was barely audible over the rising metallic groan of the dumpster lid. Mark didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the gap between the dumpster and the brick wall, his breath catching in his throat. He seemed to be processing an impossible variable introduced into his carefully calculated escape plan. The man he thought was incarcerated, the one he'd clearly double-crossed or double-crossed him severely, was somehow here, emerging from the refuse behind us. The dumpster lid finally lifted high enough, too high for a small animal, too steady for the wind, and the first thing I saw was a massive, scarred hand gripping the rim. The hand was followed by a face that was instantly, sickeningly familiar to Mark, though utterly unknown to me. It was a face built for brutality. Thick neck, small, deep-set eyes, and a jagged scar running from his hairline down to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent, predatory sneer. This man wasn't concerned with subtle intimidation like the man in the black sedan. He was pure, immediate threat. He spotted Mark instantly, his focus snapping past me as if I were a poorly rendered piece of scenery. "Well, well," the brute rumbled, his voice coarse and grating, the very sound confirming the years spent in institutional settings. "Look what the city dragged in. You really thought you could skip town, Marky, after what you did to my investment, and you brought a souvenir?" His eyes flicked to me, a brief, assessing glance, before returning to Mark with cold amusement. Mark finally broke, shoving me hard toward the far end of the alley, away from the dumpster and toward the street where the black sedan was still waiting patiently. "Run, Clara, go to the police, tell them Victor's name," he screamed, turning to face the man emerging from the trash. It was a futile, suicidal gesture. Mark, the man who had abandoned me when I was frail and dying, was now attempting to be a martyr. Victor, the name snapped through my brain like a code, took a heavy step onto the ground, planting himself squarely between Mark and the alley exit. He moved with the slow, deliberate menace of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere left to go. "Investment, Mark? That was my pension fund you gambled away on those Venezuelan bonds," Victor chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. He took another step, and Mark instinctively backed up, tripping over a discarded pallet. He went down hard, landing on his hip. The situation had inverted terrifyingly. Mark was now the victim, completely outmatched, begging for his life, while I, the victim of his prior abandonment, was the only person who had a clear path to escape. The black sedan was still idling across the street, an open invitation to safety, but Mark's desperate cry still echoed in my mind. "Tell them Victor's name." I looked from Mark, pinned against the grimy asphalt, to the menacing figure of Victor advancing on him, and then across the street to the waiting sedan. The man in the sedan hadn't moved, but the silence was deafening. They were waiting for Mark to be brought to them. My survival instinct screamed flee, but my rational mind wrestled with the knowledge that if I left Mark here, Victor would likely kill him, and I would always wonder if I could have saved the husk of the man who had once been my husband simply by naming the threat. I took one shaky step back toward the street. If I could just cross the road, get to the convenience store, maybe I could call 911 and give them Victor's name before they saw me. As I moved, Victor glanced over his shoulder, finally acknowledging my presence again. He seemed momentarily confused, perhaps not expecting the frail, pale woman he'd just seen being dragged through the building to suddenly show strength. That split-second distraction was all Mark needed. With a surge of desperate energy, born of pure terror, Mark didn't try to fight Victor. Instead, he scrambled past Victor's leg, tucking low, and bolted toward the street, aiming for the car that was clearly waiting for him. "No, you don't!" Victor roared, abandoning his slow pace. He lunged for Mark's ankle but missed. Mark surged into the open street, dangerously close to the oncoming traffic, sprinting directly toward the driver's side of the black sedan. I watched, frozen, as Mark reached the car, yanked the handle, and threw himself inside. He was safe, or as safe as he could be. The door slammed shut. The driver, the man with the silver ring, leaned over and locked the other doors instantly. Victor stopped dead in the middle of the alley, staring at the departing sedan with an expression of murderous disbelief. He turned his furious gaze on me, the only person left. I was standing there, exposed, halfway between the dead end of the alley and the open street. "You!" Victor snarled, his eyes narrowing dangerously. You brought him here." He started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately, his massive hands balling into fists. I realized with sickening clarity that I wasn't an innocent bystander. I was now the replacement target. I took a desperate step back toward the shadow of the dumpster, knowing there was nowhere else to run. Just as Victor lunged the final few feet toward me, my cell phone, which had fallen under the sofa, buzzed violently from inside the apartment. It wasn't a ringtone. It was a harsh, insistent notification sound. It was so loud, so unexpected, that Victor actually paused, momentarily distracted by the foreign noise emanating from the place he'd just failed to capture his main quarry. It was the emergency alert system, the kind that sounds off for natural disasters or Amber Alerts. I instinctively knew it wasn't for me. But the sudden interruption gave me the precious second I needed. I didn't run back into the apartment. Instead, I turned and sprinted full tilt in the opposite direction, down the alley toward the far end, the one Victor had blocked moments before. As I reached the narrow, dark opening, I looked back. Victor was charging toward the phone notification, his focus entirely split between the buzzing device inside the apartment and the sight of me disappearing into the shadows. But as I glanced back across the avenue, I saw the taillights of the black sedan flare brightly, and the car accelerated rapidly, peeling out into the main traffic flow, not toward the main highway, but turning sharply onto a side street, clearly heading in the same direction I was now running, and they were gaining ground. The sight of the black sedan turning onto the side street confirmed my worst fear. Mark hadn't just escaped. He had taken the bait and was leading his captors directly toward wherever I was headed, perhaps thinking he was putting distance between himself and Victor, or perhaps realizing too late that the sedan was the primary exit strategy for the entire operation. Either way, I was running not just from Victor, but now toward the unknown destination of my unfaithful, suddenly criminal ex-husband and his silent, menacing associates. I pumped my legs, forcing my lungs to ignore the searing pain. The alley opened onto a quiet residential street, a different world from the neon chaos of the avenue. I dared a glance over my shoulder. Victor was still inside the apartment building entrance, momentarily confused by the emergency alert blaring from my living room. He'd heard the phone, and he was hesitating, clearly debating which threat, the escaping prisoner or the evidence left behind, was more pressing. That hesitation bought me perhaps 10 seconds. I turned the corner onto Elm Street, keeping to the deep shadows cast by overgrown oak trees, moving away from the general direction of the sedan. I knew I couldn't outrun a car, not carrying the residual weakness of my past illness. I needed leverage, a place to hide, or someone to witness this unfolding nightmare. My gaze landed on the only structure on this quiet block that looked remotely occupied late at night, a small, brightly lit community center, hosting what looked like a late-night Narcotics Anonymous meeting, judging by the homemade sign taped to the window. Desperation clawed at me. I didn't know Mark's secrets, but I knew Victor looked like someone who wouldn't hesitate to hurt an innocent bystander, and I was no longer innocent. I threw myself against the heavy wooden door of the center. It wasn't locked. I stumbled into a small foyer where a woman with kind, tired eyes was sitting at a sign-in desk. She looked up, startled by my frantic entrance. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked, rising slightly. "No, I'm in danger. There are people after me. A black sedan." I gasped, fighting for breath, pointing vaguely back the way I came. Before the kind woman could process my warning, the door to the main meeting room swung open behind me, and a wave of voices spilled out, not loud, but a chorus of quiet concern. "Just tell them what happened, Clara." A voice suddenly cut through my panic. It was Mark. I spun around. He wasn't coming from the sedan. He was standing in the doorway of the NA meeting room, looking cleaner than he had an hour ago, his terror replaced by a strange, resolute calm. He had somehow doubled back, bypassed Victor, and slipped into the only place he knew I might run to for safety. He was wearing a borrowed, slightly ill-fitting jacket, but his eyes were clear. "You?" I whispered, stunned. "Where's the car? Where are the others?" "They're dealing with Victor," Mark said, his voice low but firm, addressing the room full of attentive strangers. I had to make a choice when I saw that fire escape. I knew what would happen if I ran with them, and I knew what would happen if I stayed. I told them I'd meet them at the drop point, but I needed one person to know the truth. He looked directly at me, his expression devoid of the charm he once used to hide his lies. Clara, I didn't leave you because you were sick. I left because I was in deep with a construction debt scheme run by Victor's organization. When I got sick, I panicked, knowing they'd come after me, and I dragged you down with me. I ran because I was scared for you, not because I stopped loving you. I used the emergency alert on your phone to signal an exit, knowing you'd be distracted, and then I doubled back here. He walked toward me, pulling something small and crumpled from his jacket pocket, a thin stack of faded receipts and bank statements. This is everything, he said, pressing the papers into my hand. The offshore accounts, the names of the shell corporations, the ledger linking Victor to the city council members who let him operate. It proves I was laundering money for them, and it proves Victor was running this racket. They think I have the physical ledger in the car. I threw them off the scent by taking the decoy route. But this... He tapped the papers in my hand. This is the real evidence. They want this more than they want me. The kind woman from the desk stepped forward, placing a steady hand on my arm. We have a back exit here, dear, and a phone line we can use to call the authorities safely. You're safe now. Mark gave me a final, piercing look. A look of true regret, not self-pity. Go, use that evidence. It's the only way to make the last 7 years mean something. I'll handle Victor and the sedan. Tell them everything you saw, Clara. Don't let them erase me this time. Before I could protest, before I could ask him what he meant by handle Victor, the heavy glass door of the NA Center burst inward with a splintering crash. Standing silhouetted in the doorway, flanked by 2 hulking men, was the man from the convenience store, the lookout. He wasn't smiling. He was holding a heavy chrome object that looked distinctly like a tire iron, and he was walking directly toward Mark, who stood unarmed in the center of the room, surrounded by recovering addicts. The sirens, finally, were still miles away,